Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a question that feels ancient but is incredibly relevant. Why do humans seem to keep repeating the same patterns, especially when it comes to our leaders and, how we organize ourselves?
It's a really core question, yeah. And the stack of sources you've shared proposes looking at it through a specific lens, what it calls the science of human rules, particularly how artificial intelligence might shed some light on this.
Right, these sources pull together ideas about, well, human nature, governance structures, and specific mechanisms like the U.S. presidential accountability and removal process, stuff like that.
Exactly. The compelling idea here is that AI, by acting almost like a mirror reflecting our vast history of behavior back at us, it can help uncover what the material calls predictable patterns
Patterns in how we behave.
and the rules we create.
That's the idea. In how humans behave and the rules we constantly create, follow, and, well, break. Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to cut through these diverse sources and really extract the most crucial insights, the real nuggets to understand this complex interplay. How different fields see it, why we seem to stumble over ourselves, and maybe where AI actually fits in.
Yeah, let's explore what this science looks like. It's quite a concept.
Perfect. So where does the material start with defining this science of human rules from this AI angle? It sounds a bit like science fiction, honestly, but the sources suggest it's an area uniquely suited for AI analysis.
Well, from an AI perspective, what's fascinating here is that human behavior, societal structures, governance, it's not just messy history, it's data. It's an opportunity for analysis. AI can look at all that complexity and try to understand, explain, find structure within it.
So it's about finding the underlying code, sort of, the logic behind the mess.
Precisely. It's rooted in AI's capacity to uncover those predictable patterns in human nature. The underlying idea is that there are principles driving why we create rules, why we mostly follow them, and crucially, why we deviate.
And to understand this, the sources are saying we need to pull from, well, everywhere, it seems.
Oh, absolutely. The material makes it really clear this isn't a siloed field. It grabs insights from philosophy, history, genetics, biology,
Wow.
physics, mathematics, logic, psychology, looking specifically at things like states of mind and belief systems, and sociology too. It's about synthesizing this incredibly broad range of knowledge.
That's a serious library needed for that, a lot to connect.
It is, but the purpose seems clear. Explain this science, analyze its impact across history and life, pinpoint why we break rules, and then propose how AI might help improve things. The ultimate goal, as the sources put it, is fostering a healthy, normal, and prosperous human society and a balanced universe.
Quite ambitious.
Very ambitious. Okay, if that's the science framework, where do we even begin to understand the human part of these rules? What drives us?
The sources immediately go to the fundamental tension, this push and pull between individual self-interest and the well-being of the group, collective welfare. This sounds like classic philosophical debates we've all heard about. Egoism versus the greater good.
It is. The material definitely references concepts like egoism, where the self is the primary motivation, and utilitarianism, which aims to maximize overall happiness for the most people. You're familiar with these ideas, but the sources frame them not just as abstract philosophy, but as a fundamental, pervasive dilemma that's just inherent in human nature.
A constant tug of war inside us, maybe.
Exactly. And it directly shapes how we create rules and whether we stick to them. Any system of rules has to somehow navigate this core conflict.
Okay, that makes sense.
And here's a surprising insight from the sources, how utilitarianism provides a direct, consequentialist framework that AI can actually leverage. Because it judges rules by their outcomes, aiming for that healthy, normal, and prosperous human society, AI can perform the necessary calculations and logical arguments to evaluate different rule sets.
So AI can model the consequences, see which rules actually work best for the group.
Right. AI can simulate outcomes and identify which rules might maximize utility, even if they seem counterintuitive from a purely individualistic standpoint.
Okay, so AI gives utilitarianism this powerful computational engine. But is this tension just a philosophical idea, or is it grounded deeper? Is it biological?
The sources very explicitly ground this tension in biology and evolution. They note Adam Smith's observation that we act out of self-interest and concern for others, which inevitably leads to conflict.
Right. And yet we're also incredibly cooperative animals, aren't we?
We are. Humans are described as remarkably altruistic primates, capable of really complex cooperation, sharing food, dividing labor, even extending beyond our immediate kin, often driven by empathy. But then this bumps up against the basic tenets of evolutionary biology.
Which tends to favor individual survival, right? Passing on your own genes.
Precisely. Evolutionary forces straightforwardly favor individual fitness, which suggests selfishness should be the default strategy. Indiscriminate altruism isn't really favored because it costs the individual without a clear payoff.
So altruism needs a reason, evolutionarily speaking.
It seems so. It typically evolves through mechanisms like kin selection, helping those who share your genes, or reciprocal altruism is scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, basically, benefiting those likely to reciprocate the favor.
So biology might predispose us to conditional cooperation then. We help, but there are usually strings attached, consciously or not.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. Behavioral economics studies back this up. We do value others' welfare, but generally less than our own. And the sources highlight a really critical finding. Even a small number of selfish, uncooperative individuals can precipitate the collapse of group-level cooperation.
Wow. Just a few bad apples.
Exactly. Which points to a critical need for sanctions. Rules need teeth.
That's a significant biological grounding for why rules need enforcement mechanisms. It's not just about abstract morality.
It suggests the tension between self-preservation and cooperation isn't just a learned behavior. It's rooted deep in our biology. These social dilemmas aren't just theoretical puzzles for philosophers. They're inherent challenges we face because of how we've evolved.
So rules have to work with that biology, not just against it.
Right. Appeals to just be good might not be enough. And that need for sanctions is a direct link to why accountability mechanisms, like, say, a U.S. presidential accountability process, are so fundamental. They're designed as counters to our potential biological leanings towards self-interest when it conflicts with the group good.
Okay. So with this complex, biologically rooted nature, how do we even begin to form societies with rules? This sounds like where social contract theories come in. They're like the blueprints, maybe.
Yes, exactly. These are the philosophical frameworks for how organized society and rules might emerge. The core concept is individuals agreeing, implicitly or explicitly, to trade some of their natural freedoms for protection and order.
And thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau had vastly different ideas about what that contract should look like, didn't they?
Oh, wildly different. You know, Hobbes's view in Leviathan life in a state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, a war of all against all. His solution: cede almost all rights to an absolute sovereign for security, and crucially, no right to rebel.
A pretty stark vision. Locke offered a different foundation, though, more optimistic.
Somewhat. Locke, in his second treatise, saw a state of nature that already had a law of nature and natural rights, life, liberty, property, but it lacks security and impartial enforcement. So government acts as a neutral judge to secure those rights and promote the common good. He was a strong advocate for inviolate freedom under law and, very importantly, the people's right to rebel against a tyrannical government that violates those rights.
A huge difference there. And Rousseau, his idea of the general will is kind of unique.
Rousseau, in The Social Contract, had this idea that humans were naturally good but got corrupted by society. His contract is based on the general will, the collective interest of the community. Individuals surrender all their rights to the community, ensuring equal conditions for everyone. By obeying laws derived from this general will, individuals are paradoxically forced to be free because they're obeying their collective rational self.
Forced to be free, that's quite a phrase.
It is. And he didn't really emphasize a right to rebel against the general will itself, because ideally, it represents collective self-governance.
So these are fundamentally different ways of trying to balance liberty and authority. Individual freedom versus group security.
They absolutely are. They provide the foundational arguments for why societies form and why rules are created, showing these different approaches to structuring governance. The act of contracting itself is essentially the human attempt to engineer rules, recognizing that unchecked self-interest just isn't sustainable.
It leads to chaos.
Exactly. And the surprising insight from the sources here is how this ongoing philosophical debate, especially the contrast over sovereign power versus citizen rights, like you see between Hobbes and Locke, directly mirrors the persistent challenges we still face in designing governance today, particularly with things like presidential accountability mechanisms.
So it's society still wrestling with that Lockean tension, adjusting the boundaries between authority and liberty.
Precisely. It's a continuous negotiation.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, let's bring in another framework that really formalizes this tension between individual and collective interests. Game theory.
Right, game theory offers a mathematical and logical way to model and analyze that exact conflict. It explores how rational individuals interact and what strategies are likely to emerge.
And the central concept here that keeps cropping up is the social dilemma.
Yes. A social dilemma is basically a situation where individuals, each acting perfectly rationally in their own self-interest, end up with a collectively worse outcome than if they had somehow managed to coordinate or cooperate.
The classic prisoner's dilemma is the go-to example for this, isn't it?
It perfectly illustrates the problem. Each individual player has a strong incentive to defect, to betray the other, because the payoff structure makes that the rational choice, regardless of what the other player does. Even though if they both cooperated, they'd both be better off.
And we see this play out in real-world scenarios all the time, like the tragedy of the commons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like overfishing or pollution. Individuals exploit a shared resource, the ocean, the air, for personal gain, leading to its depletion or degradation because the cost of that exploitation is spread out among everyone while the benefit is concentrated.
So game theory provides this rigorous, almost scientific basis for why humans struggle to cooperate, even when it's clearly in our long-term collective interest.
It gives us a mathematical demonstration of this science of human rules. It shows that rule breaking, especially when it involves sacrificing immediate individual gain for the common good, isn't just a moral failure, it can be a predictable outcome under certain incentive structures.
Which is where the sources say AI could be really valuable.
Yes, because AI has the potential ability to model these incredibly complex incentive structures, simulate interactions, and maybe help us design systems that avoid these traps.
And the research on repeated games, where players interact multiple times, that's telling too, isn't it? It's not just a one-shot deal.
Oh, it's crucial. It shows that sustaining cooperation is dynamic and fragile. Even if cooperative strategies like tit-for-tat can evolve, the always defect strategy often persists. And as we mentioned earlier, it just takes a small number of selfish, uncooperative individuals to potentially cause cooperation to collapse entirely.
So cooperation is unstable.
It can be. This emphasizes that social contracts aren't static things you set up once. They need continuous reinforcement, adaptation, trust building. And the concept of noise, or imperfect information in these games, also implies that accountability mechanisms have to be adaptive. They need to handle ongoing interactions, occasional defections, and the fact that we don't always know exactly what others are doing or why.
Okay, so we're seeing how biology, philosophy, and math all converge to explain this core tension. It's coming at it from different angles, but pointing to the same fundamental dynamic.
They absolutely do. Genetics and biology give us the evolutionary basis, that raw material of self-interest and altruism the innate tendencies rules have to contend with. Philosophy provides the conceptual blueprints, the ideas about how society should be structured, how rules should function.
And game theory gives us the formal, logical tools to analyze the should versus the is.
Right, a way to model the interactions, predict behavior, and maybe even design rules based on logical outcomes. And then history, of course, shows us how these social contracts have actually played out over time, how our understanding of rule-breaking changes, how governance adapts, or fails to.
And bringing it back to the individual level, psychology plays a huge role too, doesn't it? Our own minds.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. The sources emphasize that how rules are perceived, interpreted, and ultimately followed is deeply shaped by our internal state of mind and our belief systems. Things like cognitive biases, moral disengagement, our collective conscience, deeply held values, these aren't just personal quirks. They significantly influence how we interact with the rules around us.
Even things like taking risks.
Yeah, the sources even mention human gambling, how our tolerance for uncertainty impacts decision-making in this context.
So our behavior isn't just a straightforward response to external rules, it's filtered through this complex internal world.
Precisely. And the combination of all these fields, biology, philosophy, math, history, psychology, suggests human behavior isn't just random or arbitrary. It seems influenced by these multi-layered pattern dynamics. Some might be deterministic, others probabilistic, but it makes behavior potentially subject to scientific analysis.
Which is the whole premise of this science of human rules.
Exactly. The mention of physics in the source material seems to imply a belief in underlying universal principles that allow for this kind of scientific approach.
And it sounds like there's a constant feedback loop between our internal states and the external structures, the rules.
That's a critical insight, especially for any AI modeling. Rules aren't just external constraints imposed on us. They're deeply intertwined with our beliefs, our biases, our values. Our internal states influence the external structures, like policy and politics.
And vice versa.
And vice versa. Take moral disengagement. That's a psychological mechanism allowing individuals to bypass their own internal ethical standards, which then directly impacts their external conduct. Deviance itself shows how external norms are challenged or reinforced based on internal motivations. Understanding this feedback loop is crucial if you want to intervene effectively. You might need to target both individual cognition and the systemic structures.
Which leads us right to the core question. Why do humans deviate? Why, despite having rules supposedly for the collective good, do we so frequently break them?
Yeah, the sources state pretty clearly this isn't a simple answer. It's usually due to a complex mix of factors, and often goes beyond just deliberate malice or defiance.
And cognitive biases are a major factor mentioned, our mental shortcuts.
They really are. These are systematic patterns in thinking that can lead to suboptimal judgments and decisions, impacting everything from our personal choices right up to major public policy. They influence how we perceive norms, how we interpret information, and can even lead us to justify rejecting or accepting principles, sometimes without even realizing it.
And these biases can actually stem from our values. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but yes, the sources highlight things like moralistic values, which is a willingness to impose your values on others, kind of regardless of the actual consequences, and protected values. Values held as absolute, sacred almost, immune to trade-offs. These can actively get in the way of maximizing overall utility because the principle becomes more important than the outcome.
Like sticking to a rule even if it's causing harm in a specific situation.
Potentially, yes. Or consider parochialism, the tendency to favor our own in-group over out-groups. That's a bias that demonstrably worsens the total good when you look at the bigger picture.
So sometimes our values, which we intend to be good, can actually lead us to make decisions that are bad for the collective.
That's a really surprising insight from the sources, I think. They note how moral beliefs are incredibly significant in citizen behavior, often overriding even direct financial impact. Think about how people vote, for example. While self-interest is obviously a key driver, our values profoundly shape how we interpret and interact with the rules.
Can we do anything about these biases? Can we counteract them?
The sources seem cautiously optimistic. They suggest individuals can learn to recognize and overcome them to some extent. And crucially, laws and institutions can be designed specifically to mitigate their effects. Rule breaking isn't always deliberate defiance. It can sometimes be seen as rational from a bias perspective, what the material calls rational irrationality, or using low information rationality shortcuts when we don't have all the facts or time.
And this is where AI could potentially step in again.
This is where it gets really interesting, yeah. AI could potentially be trained to identify, predict, and maybe even mitigate these biases in high-stakes decision-making, like in governance.
How would that work?
By analyzing patterns in decisions and data, AI could potentially flag choices that seem heavily influenced by biases like moralistic values or parochialism. It could then highlight the predictable cost of those rules in terms of outcomes. It might offer real-time feedback, suggest alternative policies based on maximizing utility, or even help design nudges or educational interventions to help humans recognize and work around their own biases for better collective outcomes.
So AI acts as a kind of cognitive mirror, maybe, showing us where our own thinking might be leading to suboptimal results for the group.
That's a good way to think about it.
Okay, what about a more active psychological process? Not just biases, but actively convincing yourself that harmful actions are okay.
That's where moral disengagement comes in. It's described as a psychological process that allows individuals to disconnect their actions from their internal ethical standards. It essentially lets you engage in harmful or unethical conduct without feeling guilt or condemning yourself. You reframe the behavior as acceptable without actually changing your underlying moral code.
How does that process work? What are the tricks our minds play?
The sources list several specific mechanisms. There's moral justification portraying harmful acts as serving some higher purpose. Think of torture for information or religiously justified violence. Then there's euphemistic labeling using sanitized language to obscure the harm. Things like wasting people servicing the target, collateral damage. It distances the act from its reality.
Sounds familiar. What else?
Advantageous comparison, making your harmful act seem trivial by comparing it to something perceived as much worse. Well, what I did was bad, but look at what they did.
Shifting the blame or diffusing it seems common too.
benefits, exactly. Displacement of responsibility attributes the blame to an authority figure, the classic, "I was just following orders." Diffusion of responsibility spreads the blame out within a group or across a complex division of labor, so no single individual feels fully accountable. Anonymity helps here too.
And just ignoring the consequences.
Disregarding or misrepresenting injurious consequences, yeah. Minimizing the harm caused or selectively focusing on perceived benefits while ignoring the damage done.
And the most chilling one mentioned is dehumanization.
Yes, denying the humanity of the victims, viewing them as objects, animals, or some lesser form of being. This strips them of moral standing in the perpetrator's mind and makes it much easier to inflict harm.
Understanding these mechanisms feels crucial.
It really is, because they show how individuals can bypass their own internal standards, enabling actions that clearly violate rules, but without experiencing self-condemnation. Rule-breaking in these cases isn't necessarily a rejection of the rule's legitimacy, but an internal psychological maneuver.
And that has huge implications for accountability, right? If someone genuinely believes they were justified.
Absolutely. They may believe their actions were necessary or righteous or simply not their responsibility. It complicates things significantly.
And this whole process, this moral disengagement, is amplified by power dynamics, isn't it?
Yes, the sources strongly emphasize this connection. Power dynamics are fundamental in organizations and governance. They deeply influence decision-making, relationships, and, as the sources state, unchecked power frequently leads to ethical issues, corruption, abuse, exploitation.
So power makes it easier to disengage morally.
It can create the conditions for it. Equitable power distribution is seen as essential for supporting ethical choices. The sources also point to those subtle forms of power, silent power, embedded in cultural practices that dictate whose voice gets heard, and structural power baked into systems that reinforce hierarchies. These are widespread, often overlooked, but can create environments where moral disengagement can flourish, particularly among those holding power. It becomes a kind of systemic vulnerability, where moral erosion can become collective.
So we need governance systems that actively counter this.
Exactly. Robust governance with transparency, inclusivity, checks on power. These aren't just nice-to-haves. They're necessary countermeasures.
So deviance isn't just about individual psychology, it's profoundly social and structural, too.
No.
How do sociologists look at this?
Precisely. Sociological perspectives view deviance, which is basically any action violating social norms, whether formal laws or informal customs, not just as individual pathology, but as something shaped by societal dynamics. And norms themselves vary across cultures and evolve over time.
And deviance isn't always bad.
Interestingly, no. Some deviance can be positive, pushing boundaries. The sources touch on different theories here.
Like Durkheim's idea that deviance is actually functional for society. That sounds odd.
It's a surprising insight, isn't it? Structural functionalism, particularly through Durkheim, argues deviance is normal and serves necessary functions. It helps affirm shared values and norms by clarifying what isn't acceptable. It defines moral boundaries. It forces a collective reaction, strengthening social bonds. And sometimes it pushes moral boundaries in ways that lead to positive social change.
So breaking rules can sometimes lead to better rules.
In a way, yes. Durkheim argued it offends the collective conscience, but in doing so it clarifies what the collective actually believes. Then you have Merton's strain theory, which adds another layer suggesting that tension between societal goals, like achieving wealth, and the legitimate means available to achieve them can actually push people towards deviance, like crime. Society itself creates the pressure.
Society putting pressure on people to break rules. Makes sense.
Then, symbolic interactionism looks at how deviant behaviors are learned through interaction with others. That's differential association theory. Or how people justify their deviant actions through techniques of neutralization, denying responsibility, denying injury, appealing to higher loyalties. Labeling theory is also key here, how society applying a deviant label can actually lead someone to internalize that identity and act accordingly.
So the label itself creates the behavior.
It can reinforce it, certainly. And finally, control theory flips the question. It asks why people don't deviate. The answer, it suggests, is strong social bonds, attachment, commitment, involvement, belief make deviance too costly. Weak bonds allow it.
And conflict theory, that sees it all as power struggles.
Pretty much. Society functions through groups struggling to maximize their benefits. Deviance is seen as behavior that conflicts with the interests of the powerful institutions. Laws are often viewed as tools of oppression. disproportionately targeting the powerless.
So the big takeaway from sociology seems to be that deviance is complex. It serves functions, it's learned, it's labeled, it's linked to power.
Exactly. It's not just a simple bad thing. It's shaped by cultural contexts, structural pressures, and power dynamics. Addressing it requires a comprehensive approach that looks at the individual's internal state, their social environment, and the larger structures they exist within.
Okay, bringing this right up to the highest levels of governance. The U.S. Presidential Accountability and Removal Mechanism seems like a critical, real-world example of this human rules science in action, trying to manage power.
It's designed specifically for that purpose, to manage executive power and mitigate the inherent risks of rule-breaking at that level. And the sources absolutely hammer home that transparency is foundational for accountability.
Can't hold someone accountable if you don't know what they did?
Precisely. An actor must disclose their activities, explain them, answer questions about them, and ultimately be subject to potential consequences from various bodies, prosecutors, inspectors general, Congress, the press, civil society, the public. Accountability simply fails if actions remain hidden.
Transparency is the first domino to fall.
Yes, and it actually has a secondary advantage the sources mention. Even when political actors bitterly disagree on whether to prohibit specific actions, they might still be able to agree on rules requiring transparency about those actions. It's sometimes an easier point of consensus.
Have there been recent efforts to enhance this transparency?
Yes, the sources mention recent reforms, like the December 2022 change to the CASE Act. This expanded the requirement for the executive branch to report and publicize international agreements, both binding and non-binding. The idea is to enable better monitoring and potential pushback from Congress and the public.
But challenges remain, especially with political polarization being so high.
Oh, significant challenges. The sources highlight how political polarization can severely undermine transparency norms. The example given is voluntary presidential tax return disclosure, something that used to be a universally observed norm stopped being universal. It shows how partisan conflict can erode the very foundation of accountability.
So transparency proposals might need to be designed differently now.
Possibly. They might need to be configured specifically to minimize partisan conflict, perhaps with deferred effective dates or specialized formats, though the sources don't detail specifics.
And judicial interpretations of presidential power can create roadblocks, too.
Yes, particularly interpretations around things like presidential immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. These can create significant hurdles for accountability efforts.
Are there concrete legislative approaches being proposed to address some of these gaps?
The Protecting Our Democracy Act, or PODA, is mentioned specifically. It's described as aiming to prevent abuses of power, restore checks and balances, and enhance accountability and transparency.
What kind of things are in it?
Proposed elements include creating a specific cause of action related to the 14th Amendment's insurrection bar, tolling criminal statutes of limitations during a president's term so the clock doesn't run out, shedding more light on the pardon power, strengthening bribery statutes, and enhancing congressional oversight of the White House. The sources argue these kinds of measures are needed to help ensure officials prioritize the public interest over personal or political gain.
So the effectiveness of accountability isn't just about having the formal laws on the books.
Crucially, no. The sources are very clear on this. Accountability hinges on the formal legal mechanisms, plus the informal pressures, the constant vigilance and pressure from inspectors general, from Congress, from the press, from civil society organizations, and ultimately from the public. Formal processes are often insufficient without these active informal channels keeping the pressure on.
And polarization hurts both the formal and informal systems.
It absolutely does. When partisan advantage consistently gets prioritized over upholding accountability norms, the entire foundation erodes. The tax filing example shows how quickly norms can collapse in a polarized environment. This demands adaptive strategies, perhaps accountability mechanisms less susceptible to partisan manipulation, and certainly efforts to foster a political culture that actually values transparency and accountability above short-term political wins. Easier said than done, of course.
It really seems to connect directly back to those ethical considerations of power dynamics we talked about earlier.
Yes, power dynamics are just fundamental to how organizations and governments function, and they profoundly influence ethical behavior. As the sources emphasize, while power can certainly be a force for innovation and getting things done, unchecked power frequently leads to ethical problems. Corruption, abuse, exploitation. The ethical ideal involves a more equitable distribution of power that supports ethical choices.
And those subtle forms of power, the silent and structural kinds, are easy to miss but really impactful.
Right. Silent power that comes from cultural practices dictating whose voice is even heard, and structural power that's embedded in the very systems and hierarchies we operate within. These are pervasive, often overlooked, but they create environments where ethical lapses and moral disengagement can really flourish, particularly among those who already hold power. Addressing inequality means addressing these power structures.
So the ethical responsibility falls most heavily on those with power.
Absolutely. The sources are clear. Those holding power have a significant ethical obligation to use it responsibly, ideally for the benefit of others, not just themselves. Key practices mentioned include actively recognizing power imbalances, consciously avoiding exploitation, genuinely seeking input, especially from those with less power, and considering the long-term impact of decisions beyond just immediate gains.
And the actual governance structures themselves play a big role in managing these dynamics.
They absolutely dictate the dynamics. Highly centralized systems, for instance, can heighten the risk of corruption and abuse because power is concentrated. More decentralized systems might promote accountability and inclusivity. The sources point to effective mechanisms like independent oversight boards, participatory decision-making processes, things designed to rectify imbalances, and inclusive leadership styles encouraging open dialogue, empowering others, creating psychological safety can actively counteract power asymmetry.
It sounds like power isn't just an ethical challenge in itself. Unchecked power is an ethical risk multiplier. It makes other problems worse.
That's a critical insight from the material, yes. Unchecked power exacerbates the potential for rule breaking. It enables those moral disengagement mechanisms we discussed because there are fewer external checks to counter the internal psychological maneuvers. It can create a really damaging feedback loop. Power facilitates rule breaking, successful rule breaking entrenches that power, leading to a downward spiral of ethical erosion.
Which really underscores the need for systemic ethical governance, doesn't it? Not just relying on individuals to be virtuous, especially when they have power.
Precisely. Accountability isn't just about finding and punishing individual bad actors after the fact. It requires robust systemic frameworks embedding transparency, inclusivity, strong checks on power right into the system's design. The system itself must be designed to mitigate the inherent risks of power imbalance, using things like participatory governance, independent audits, strong whistleblower protections, and so on.
Okay, let's shift to another really complex challenge for human rules, particularly at high levels like government, the issue of aging officials and potential cognitive decline.
This is a significant ethical and practical issue that the sources highlight. Yeah. With populations aging, officials, the example given is federal judges, averaging age 69 or working longer. This naturally raises concerns about the potential impact of age-related cognitive changes on their ability to perform critical duties safely and effectively.
But you can't just force people out simply because they reach a certain age, legally.
Generally, no. Laws like the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, ADEA, prohibit mandatory retirement for most jobs, with only very limited exceptions, like some public safety roles or specific judicial positions in some places. And the sources note, this ban is generally prudent. You don't want to lose effective, experienced workers, and many people need or want to work longer for financial or psychological reasons.
So what about cognitive testing then? Can institutions test older officials to ensure they're still up to the job?
That's where it gets legally and ethically very complex. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, generally prohibits requiring current employees, including older ones, to undergo medical exams like cognitive tests unless there's objective evidence of a current performance deficit.
You need a reason.
You need a reason tied to their job performance. Testing is only permitted if it's demonstrably job-related, consistent with business necessity, and importantly, triggered by evidence of current performance problems.
So you can't just preemptively test everyone in high-stakes roles, like judges or maybe even a president, just because they're over a certain age.
Generally, no. Not under current U.S. law for current employees. There are several problems. There's no single universally accepted test for overall cognitive competency. Testing can raise concerns about disparate impact discrimination, potentially screening out certain groups more than others. And testing all employees would be incredibly costly, logistically difficult, and magnify the legal risks under the ADA and Title VII. Plus, predictive genetic testing for conditions like Alzheimer's is specifically unlawful under ADA rules regarding medical exams.
So how can institutions ethically and lawfully ensure competence in these critical roles then?
The sources suggest the focus should be on regular, objective job performance evaluations. If these assessments reveal concrete problems that genuinely suggest potential cognitive decline might be impacting essential job functions, then targeted job-related cognitive testing becomes legally permissible.
And if deficits are found,
If testing confirms deficits impacting the job, the employer then has a legal obligation under the ADA to engage in an interactive process with the employee to explore reasonable accommodations.
yeah.
That could mean things like memory aids, adjusted work hours, reassigning marginal tasks. Separation or removal should only be a last resort, used only if no reasonable accommodation is possible, and the worker either poses a direct safety risk or is truly unable to perform the essential functions of the job even with accommodation.
So it's performance-based, not age-based.
That's the principle. Interestingly, the ADA does permit any and all testing for incoming employees after a conditional job offer, except for genetic tests. The rules are different pre- and post-employment.
This is clearly a tough balancing act. Respecting individual rights, avoiding age discrimination, maintaining dignity versus ensuring public safety and competent leadership in roles where mistakes can have huge consequences.
It really highlights a significant ethical dilemma for the science of human rules. Balancing the competence of individuals holding immense power, presidents, judges, legislators against their age and fundamental rights, is incredibly complex, especially given the potential societal risks of impaired decision-making in those roles. The rules governing this have to navigate that balance fairly, focusing on observable performance and capacity, not just age assumptions.
What kind of overall governance approach does this situation call for them, looking forward?
It really calls for proactive and adaptive governance strategies designed for workforce longevity, moving beyond blunt age-based rule towards more sophisticated systems based on robust, fair, performance-based assessments, creating a culture that supports reasonable accommodations, and investing in ongoing professional development.
Any specific recommendations?
The sources mentioned potentially revising laws like the ADA to better address future disabilities, perhaps reconsidering the sharp distinction between pre- and post-employment testing. Training supervisors on how to conduct sensitive performance discussions is key. Offering voluntary confidential wellness programs that might include cognitive testing could be helpful. And professional associations also have a role in guiding retirement norms and discussions within specific fields. Ultimately, adaptive strategies are essential for a society that wants to value both the dignity of older workers and the safety and competence of its leadership.
Okay, trying to tie all of these incredibly diverse threads together are basic human nature, the need for rules, our complex reasons for breaking them, the challenges in governance structures, issues like power dynamics, even cognitive decline in leaders. It really feels like we need a more holistic way of thinking about all this.
Absolutely. To truly grasp this idea of the science of human rules and all the challenges it identifies, the sources argue that systemic thinking is indispensable. You can't look at these pieces in isolation.
How would you define systemic thinking in this context? What does it mean practically?
It's essentially a holistic approach. It focuses on understanding how different parts of a system, whether it's a society, an organization, or an ecosystem, interact with each other and function as a cohesive whole. It's less a rigid methodology and more a mindset.
A mindset?
Yeah, a mindset that looks for connections, considers boundaries, what's in the system, what's out, identifies feedback loops, how actions influence future actions, and recognizes interdependence, how changing one part affects others. It involves considering all the relevant stakeholders, asking deeper questions about root causes, and understanding that interventions often have unforeseen consequences elsewhere in the system. It's fundamentally about managing complexity and diverse perspectives.
And like looking at the whole forest, not just individual trees.
Exactly. Think about analyzing an entire ecosystem's health or the complexities of a global supply chain, rather than just focusing on one species or one factory.
And what's the value it brings to understanding human rules?
Huge value. It helps us understand complex problems more deeply by revealing underlying structures and dynamics. It improves decision-making by forcing us to see the bigger picture and potential ripple effects. And ultimately, it promotes solutions that are more likely to be sustainable in the long run because they account for the system's complexity. The sources also note that involving stakeholders systemically can actually save time, energy, and resources compared to top-down isolated approaches.
And human societies and the rules we create are classic examples of these complex adaptive systems, right?
They absolutely are. The sources emphasize that isolated interventions, just changing one law or focusing on one type of behavior, often fail or have unintended negative consequences because you're only tweaking one part of a deeply interconnected whole. You really need that systemic view to identify the root causes of problems and anticipate those potential domino effects.
Like a policy change in one area impacting the economy, or social equity, or the environment in unexpected ways.
Precisely. Systemic thinking, by mapping those interdependencies and feedback loops, allows us to analyze these interactions more effectively and address the underlying structural issues. This is crucial for creating rules that are robust, resilient, and adaptable to changing circumstances.
How is this actually applied in the real world, according to the sources?
The sources point to several areas. In global governance, it helps understand the complex interactions between nations, international organizations, economic systems, and environmental factors to find more effective solutions and foster collaboration. For sustainable development, it means moving beyond siloed approaches and creating integrated strategies that explicitly acknowledge the links between economic growth, social equity, and environmental protection.
The UNDP example was mentioned.
Yes, as an example of using a comprehensive approach considering all the interacting factors and involving diverse stakeholders to build more effective and sustainable strategies against complex issues like poverty and inequality.
And what about complex environmental issues like climate change? That seems inherently systemic.
Absolutely. These are fundamentally systemic problems. You can't understand climate change without looking at the interactions between the climate system itself, economic development patterns, energy systems, social inequality, political decisions. It's all interconnected. A coordinated response requires seeing that whole system.
And even things like food production or recycling.
While not detailed extensively in the provided summary, the principles apply. Systemic thinking would involve analyzing these processes within their larger systems, considering ecological impacts, resource inputs, energy use, economic costs and benefits, social equity implications, waste streams, policy frameworks. Looking at the entire life cycle helps identify key leverage points for improving sustainability and avoiding unintended consequences, like shifting pollution from one area to another.
So it seems like systemic thinking provides the essential framework for designing rules and policies that can actually align individual incentives with collective well-being and long-term sustainability.
That's the argument. By understanding those complex interactions, feedback loops, and interdependencies, we can better anticipate the likely impacts of different rules or interventions. It allows us to design systems that nudge behavior towards desirable outcomes across economic, political, social, and environmental spheres. It moves us beyond simplistic cause and effect thinking to embrace the complexity, enabling the creation of more effective human rules aimed at fostering that balanced universe the sources talk about.
Okay, this brings us full circle back to the potential role of AI and not just understanding these complex systems, but actually helping to improve things and mitigate some of the challenges we've identified throughout this discussion.
Absolutely. AI offers potentially transformative capabilities in this space. The sources suggest that by leveraging its capacity for analysis, understanding, and explanation, AI could be a powerful tool in helping us move towards that healthier society and planet.
How does AI specifically help with the understanding and prediction piece in this context? We touched on this earlier.
Right. AI acts as that potential mirror reflecting human nature, as we mentioned. It can sift through massive, diverse data sets, historical records, genetic information, biological studies, records of social interactions, and decisions to identify those subtle, predictable patterns that might otherwise be hidden. It can build sophisticated models that might help predict rule adherence or deviation based on this complex interplay of factors.
And it can perform that utilitarian evaluation, judging rules by outcomes.
Potentially, yes. AI could perform the complex calculations and logical arguments needed to evaluate rules based purely on their projected outcomes for collective well-being. It could simulate different rule sets under various conditions and identify those that appear most likely to maximize overall happiness or prosperity, offering an objective, data-driven perspective to complement human judgment.
And it could even model the strategic interactions using game theory.
Precisely. AI could simulate complex game theory scenarios involving many actors and complex payoffs. This could help predict strategic interactions, identify potential social dilemmas before they become major problems, and anticipate how people might behave under different incentive structures. This, in turn, helps us design rules that are perhaps more resilient to defection and more likely to foster cooperation.
So AI isn't just a passive observer in this vision. It could actively help design better systems and rules.
That's the potential the sources explore. For policy design, AI could use insights from game theory and behavioral economics to help craft rules and incentive structures that actively align individual behavior with collective goals, hopefully mitigating things like social dilemmas and the tragedy of the commons.
And what about combating those cognitive biases you mentioned earlier? That seemed like a key area.
Yes, AI could be a powerful tool here. Imagine AI systems that could monitor decision-making processes within governance, flagging instances where human judgment seems likely influenced by known biases like moralistic values overriding outcome considerations or parochialism limiting options.
But provide a warning.
Exactly. It could highlight the potential cost of those rules in terms of outcomes, provide real-time feedback, maybe suggest alternative policy options based on maximizing utility, or even help design targeted educational interventions or nudges, small changes in how choices are presented to help humans work around their inherent cognitive shortcuts for better collective results.
How about enhancing accountability and transparency? Could AI play a role there?
Significantly, perhaps. AI could potentially automate the monitoring of certain government actions, helping to identify anomalies or potential non-compliance with transparency rules. It could analyze vast streams of public data, financial disclosures, communication records, lobbying activity to detect potential conflicts of interest, abuse of power, or even patterns indicative of moral disengagement, providing early warnings to oversight bodies or the public.
And supporting more ethical power dynamics, that seems harder to quantify.
It's definitely complex, but AI might help. For instance, AI could potentially analyze communication patterns, meeting dynamics, or resource allocation within organizations or government agencies to identify subtle indicators of silent power, suppressing certain voices, or structural power, entrenching inequality. This analysis could then inform strategies for promoting more inclusive leadership, transparent decision-making frameworks, and participatory governance structures designed to deter abuse and rectify imbalances.
And even helping with that very difficult challenge of cognitive decline in officials.
Here, AI could potentially help develop more objective, ethical, and non-discriminatory performance-based assessments for officials in high-stakes roles, focusing on job-relevant capacities rather than just age. It could analyze various job performance metrics over time to identify potential deficits that would ethically trigger targeted, job-related testing only when genuinely needed. And if deficits are found, AI might even help identify or suggest potential reasonable accommodations based on the specific needs and the job requirements.
So using data to make that process fairer and more effective?
That's the hope.
And ultimately, applying this systemic thinking you described, AI could help model those really big, complex systems.
Yes, AI guided by systemic thinking principles could potentially model incredibly complex environmental systems, climate change, biodiversity loss, resource depletion. By analyzing the vast web of interconnected factors and feedback loops, AI could help identify the root causes of degradation and propose integrated solutions that attempt to balance economic, social, and environmental considerations, much like the ideal described in the UNDP example.
And optimizing resource use, like in food systems or recycling.
Exactly. AI could analyze massive data sets across the entire agricultural system, climate impacts, soil health, crop yields, supply chain logistics, market demands to recommend more sustainable practices, minimize waste, and enhance food security. Similarly, for recycling, AI could help optimize collection routes, improve sorting technologies, analyze material flows to identify bottlenecks, and ultimately help design and manage more efficient circular economies. It's about using AI to take that holistic, systemic approach to align human activities with ecological limits and promote long-term planetary health.
It really sounds like the ultimate potential the sources envision is for AI to help identify those optimal human rules that foster balance across the board, individual versus collective, growth versus sustainability.
That seems to be the overarching promise highlighted in the sources, yes. By analyzing the vast interconnected data streams across genetics, psychology, sociology, governance, economics, and the environment, the hope is that AI could potentially identify the underlying principles or patterns for human rules that genuinely promote balance between the individual and the collective, between economic growth and environmental sustainability, between technological advancement and ethical considerations. A very grand vision.
Wow. We have certainly taken a deep dive into some incredibly complex territory today. Really fascinating stuff.
We really have. It just underscores how intricate human rules are, doesn't it? How they're so fundamentally shaped by our deepest nature, our psychological shortcuts, the social structures we build around ourselves, and the systems of power we create and navigate.
And that rule breaking, while it's often challenging and disruptive, is rarely simple. It's often a signal, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah. A signal that tells us something important, maybe about the rules themselves being flawed, or maybe about the systems they operate within needing adjustment. It prompts that necessary reevaluation and adaptation, ideally.
And understanding all of this truly requires looking across so many different disciplines. You've got ancient philosophy talking to modern biology, mathematics informing psychology, history reflecting on governance. It's all connected.
Indeed, it's profoundly interdisciplinary. And the potential role of AI woven throughout these sources is quite significant, isn't it? Not just as a passive observer or data cruncher, but potentially as an active tool. A tool that can help us analyze these complex patterns, maybe predict behaviors more accurately, design better systems, and perhaps even help us mitigate our own biases and navigate really tough challenges like ensuring competence and accountability in leadership.
Which leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. If AI can genuinely identify these predictable patterns in human behavior and the underlying science behind our rules and our deviations, how might this knowledge fundamentally change things? Not just how we understand governance and accountability, but how we actually design and ultimately live within the rules that will shape our collective future.
This is DigitView.